Welcome to the Xan Shoob podcast, where we discuss all things college football. My name is Xan. This is my co-host Shoob. We got another good show for you today, as usual. Today, we're going to go into the Big 12 and discussing the Big 12 win totals. Shoob, do you want to kick us off with how we're going to do this whole system?
Sure. So if you haven't seen one of our win total prediction videos yet, this is how we do this. Xan here, he is going to be in the X column, as you can see on the graphic. I will be in the S column, and we're going to alternate back and forth and pick over or under for each team's win totals. These lines are based off of Caesars Sportsbook, based off of today's recording date, which is July 27th. So if you're looking at this and time has passed, maybe these lines have changed a little bit. But as of right now, these are the lines for the Big 12, and we are going to roll through this conference here. This is always a fun conference to do. So without further ado, we're going to start up at the top. The Oklahoma Sooners, their line's sitting at 9.5. Xan, what do you got?
Shoob, the Oklahoma Sooners are a very, very intriguing team this year for many, many reasons, as everyone I'm sure is aware of at this point in time. Lincoln Riley has spurred them and gone to USC. Along with that, he took half of their team over there to USC. And it's just a shame. He took Caleb Williams, who arguably is probably one of the best quarterbacks in all of college football. I think when Caleb Williams comes due for the draft, in not this upcoming draft, but the next draft, I think he's going to be the number one pick because I just think he's that talented. That's a huge loss for the Sooners, Shoob. And in addition to losing Lincoln Riley, I mean, that's just a lot of continuity that they've lost over there at Oklahoma. But it's not all lost, because when you look at Oklahoma's roster, they still have a lot of talent, littered with talent, actually. They still have Marvin Mims, Theo Weiss, Drake Stoops. All these guys return. And in addition to that, they also bring in Brent Venables from Clemson. And he had the 8th rated defense in all of college football last year in terms of yards allowed, which means Oklahoma, from a recruiting standpoint, still has a lot of defensive talent. And if they have a defensive mind like Venables at the helm, then one can believe that they are going to improve defensively. Now, the only thing that really sticks out to me with Oklahoma is their offense. I know that they still have a lot of talent in their offense. Their offensive line is stellar as usual. I mean, whenever Oklahoma fans complain about having a bad offensive line, it's still better than most offensive lines. That's just kind of how it is. Oklahoma is known for having a very good offensive line, and that's no different this year. Let's look at the new quarterback, UCF transfer, Dillon Gabriel. Dillon Gabriel is a very good player in his own right, but he's not Caleb Williams. He's not Caleb Williams, Shoob. Dillon Gabriel is a very good player. I think they can be a very productive offense with Dillon Gabriel, but I think Dillon Gabriel will make more mistakes than Caleb Williams, just flat out. Caleb Williams, I think, is just an overall better quarterback, and that's not even a notch against Dillon Gabriel. I think this team will still be very good, but ultimately I think their offense will not be as effective as it was in the previous season. However, we could very well see an improved defense under Venables, but it could take some time. You know how this things work, Shoob. When you hire a new D coordinator, sometimes it takes more than a year. So we may not see the results that we're looking for in year one. But despite all of that, when you look over to Oklahoma's schedule, I think UTEP, K-State, CU, Kansas, Iowa State, Tech, Oak State, those are all wins. I mean, Oklahoma State, good program, but they own Oklahoma State. They'll probably win that yet again. I think that's just wins right there, all in abundance. The games that are probably toss-ups for them, Nebraska, K-State, Texas, Baylor. And for some reason, I just feel it. I don't have a good reason for this, but West Virginia. West Virginia, I feel like, is a team that's going to play them close, and I don't have any good reference for that. But West Virginia is just one of those teams that likes to stick around. They're very inconsistent. They can lose to anybody, but they can beat anybody. So despite all this being said, Shoob, I know I'm kind of beating around the bush here. I'm going to go with the over. I like Oklahoma for 10 wins. And I think, relatively speaking, when you look at the rest of the Big 12 this year, I think Oklahoma's got a good shot. I think they still retain a lot of talent on their roster. And I think there is a definite good chance for them to just put it all together. But I can definitely see the under if and only if the defense is not as stout as we're thinking it's going to be. But if they put that defense together with that Venables mindset, I think they're going to be in good shape. And I think Oklahoma will be in the Big 12 championship.
Wow. So based on your tone at the beginning of that analysis, I thought you were going to go under, but that was a big swing to the over there at the last second. I like it. I have a little bit of a different take on this team and on this program. Like you mentioned, with Brent Venables coming in and all the transfer portal turnover for this OU team, they were kind of like patient zero for this new transfer portal era, if you will. When Caleb Williams and all those guys left, it looked like this program was about to be gutted and they were really going to start with a rebuild. But I think Brent Venables and his coaching staff did a really good job of salvaging this team and this program for what it's worth. So there's a reason why they're picked as the favorite to win the Big 12 this season, even after all those losses. So the thing about Dylan Gabriel, their new quarterback, is yes, he probably won't live up exactly to the ceiling that Caleb Williams brought them last year, but Caleb Williams also did have his struggles last season. Let's not forget about that. He did get benched for Rattler one time after he had already taken over. And Caleb Williams certainly has superstar potential, but he wasn't perfect. He was a true freshman last year. I actually am very high on Dylan Gabriel. I've always been high on Dylan Gabriel since he was a freshman. And if you look at his numbers, he consistently had a very high passer rating, which is near the top of college football. He consistently throws the deep ball well and throws it accurate. His touchdown to interception ratios at UCF are very good. Now, I know, of course, that was at UCF against group of five competition. So I know you got to kind of take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but he's still a very good quarterback. And there's a reason why Oklahoma wanted him, because he certainly has been capable of starting in the Power Five his whole career. And now he finally gets that chance. And especially when you pair Dylan Gabriel with offensive coordinator Jeff Lebby, I think that's a really good pairing. A lot of people believe that these two are going to be linking up again and that they are going to be a very good pairing for this OU offense. And as far as the receiving core, like you mentioned, they lost a lot of top talent at receiver, but they still were able to return Marvin Mims. Theo Weiss is coming back from injury. They still do have good receivers at the top for Gabriel to throw to, though that top end depth is not there like it was last year. Last year, this receiving core was absolutely stacked. Also, Eric Ray at running back, I think, will also have a good year this season. He apparently will fit well in the Levy's system. He likes to run the ball a lot, and Eric Ray can catch the ball a lot too. So I think he's going to have a good year. And as far as the defense, you alluded to it, man. They had 6 guys drafted off of this defense, 6 guys drafted off this OU defense, and they only returned 4 starters. I agree with you about the defense probably starting out slow, learning Venables' system. Apparently, it's a pretty complicated system. And I would imagine that the defense probably struggles out of the gate, but I could totally see this being a unit that gets better as the season goes on. And as far as their schedule, that game at Nebraska week 3, that's obviously, we're going to find out what this OU team is made of when they go up there to Lincoln, but it's nice that they have a good ramp up for that with UTEP and Kent State at home. I expect this OU team to go in there and beat Nebraska. I could totally see Nebraska winning, but I think that they can pull it off. And if you look at their conference schedule, I think this schedule really benefits them this year because a lot of the tougher teams in the Big 12, they all have those teams at home. They have Kansas State at home. They have Baylor at home. They have Oklahoma State at home. I think 9 to 10 wins is probably about right for this OU team. But I think because the schedule is more favorable, they got all those games at home against the tougher teams. I think 10-2 is more likely than 9-3. So I'm going to go over, but I definitely do not believe this is a college football playoff team for that matter. I think if they get really lucky and things go their way, they could sneak into the playoff, but I think this will be a pretty competitive Big 12. But I'm with you. I think OU still is a notch above the rest at the top. And I think that Venables did a really good job salvaging this program. Tipping my cap to that because at one point it looked pretty dark for this Sooner program.
Well said. I just want to say, because when everyone was transferring, as soon as Lincoln Riley left and half of the OU football team entered the transfer portal and went to USC, it looked like it was done for OU. It looked like OU was about to fall apart. And, again, hats off to their administration. They did a great job salvaging the program as it is. But with that being said, why don't we turn over to OU's hated rival in burnt orange, being Texas? What do you got, Shoob?
And there's certainly been no lack of news with the Longhorns this offseason, especially on the recruiting trail. Man, the Texas Longhorns sitting with a win total at 9 games. Before I get to my verdict here, I think that this team definitely has enormous upside. I mean, that's a given. I think anybody can tell you that. That's no secret. Quinn Ewers, of course, the quarterback. We haven't seen him play yet. He has not taken a single snap yet in Division I college football.
Very true.
So there's a lot to see with him. We're really going to find out against UL Monroe week 1 what he's made of. And then week 2, they got Alabama coming in. So, man, it's going to be a quick slap in the face for Quinn Ewers. I'm very excited to see how that goes. I think Texas also has a good bit of quarterback depth behind them, obviously, with Hudson Card. And if you look at this Texas team last year, yeah, they are definitely one of the biggest punching bags for jokes in all of college football. They went 5-7 last year. They failed to make a bowl game, but they didn't really have the greatest luck. They went 2-5 in one possession games last year. Obviously, they were notorious for losing to Kansas at home. That was incredible to watch. But I think that this Texas offense, obviously, there's talent everywhere. The receivers should be really good. You have Xavier Worthy returns, and then you got Jordan Whittington as well. Transfer Isaiah Nair from Wyoming, who is the leading receiver there for the Wyoming Cowboys. That's a very good addition as well. So their receivers at the top end are pretty good, and they got depth there. And then their running backs. I mean, this might be the best running back duo in the entire country with Bijan Robinson and Roshan Johnson. Both those guys averaged over 6 yards per carry last year. Those guys are going to be very good. Not to mention, they also brought in Ajayi Hall and Jaleel Billingsley from Alabama as well. So as far as skill positions, Texas is very set. Their talents is there. That's certainly the case. The offensive line was good last year, but there are certainly going to be some question marks. Depth is certainly an issue. And then as far as the defense, I mean, the defense wasn't the greatest last year. It wasn't quite as bad as everyone thought it was, but the defensive line needs to improve. That definitely needs to happen. If Texas is going to hit this win total and they're going to have a double-digit win season, this defensive line needs to get good quickly. They were only 89th in FBS and line yards last year. They do have 6 starters return, but unfortunately, for me, I don't really see a whole lot of improvement ahead for this defense. Maybe a little bit, but I don't see anything major like them jumping into the top 30 or top 40 for them to hit this win total. And then the schedule. I mean, Alabama week 2 at home. Are you telling me that Quinn Ewers, a freshman that has not played a single snap of college football in his career, after UL Monroe, he's going to take down Alabama in week 2? With Bryce Young, the national championship favorites? I think everyone here can agree with us. Let's just write that off as an L. So then you have the rest of Texas' schedule, 11 games left. They already lost the game. For Texas to hit this win total, they have to go 10-1 in the rest of those games, excluding Alabama. The Texas Longhorns, a team that perennially underachieves, are you telling me they are going to go 10-2 or are they going to go 8-4? This is too easy. Until they prove me otherwise, I'm going under. I'm sorry, but that's just the truth.
I love that breakdown, Shoob. Until they prove me otherwise, the team that perennially underachieves, the Texas Longhorns. But you know what? I'm kind of in the same situation here with another orange team, the Tennessee Volunteers, another team that perennially underachieves, right? And I was kind of high on them if you look back to our past podcasts or past videos. And when you look over at Texas here, for all the same things that you just highlighted, they have a ton of talent. Their offense is absolutely littered. They will probably be a top 25 offense, if not a top 15 offense this year. I'd be absolutely shocked if they were not. Their defensive production was pretty awful last year, Shoob. They were ranked 100th in all of FBS in yards allowed, which to me spells that they can only improve, right? I mean, there's only 130 teams to be considered against. They can only improve. That is just my mindset in that. And I look over at their schedule, Shoob. I agree with you. Bama, that's an L. That is an L unless Quinn Ewers just happens to be the second coming of Peyton Manning and just becomes like the best quarterback ever. That is the only way that they're going to beat Alabama. But I just don't see it happening, Shoob. That is an L for sure. But at the same time, I look over at their schedule here. They usually play OU pretty well. I think Baylor is down this year. They lost a lot of talent to the NFL, as we'll discuss here soon. And Baylor doesn't have a lot of returning production. And then you look at some of the other Big 12 teams, there's not a lot going on there. There's a lot of lost production in the transfer portal, a lot of lost production to graduation in the draft amongst the Big 12 teams. And I consider their opponents more than anything. Although Texas does underachieve, when you look at their roster, it is just so far superior to a lot of the teams in the Big 12. Now, with that being said, Shub, superiority doesn't necessarily buy you wins because Texas usually does have a superior roster to a lot of teams in the Big 12, and yet they continually underachieve. But you can only underachieve for so long, Shub. And I think Texas has so many pieces, so many weapons. They have so much NFL talent, especially on the offensive side of the ball, that I think it's going to
Oh,
be able to make
don't
up for
do
a
it.
lot of. I
Don't
think
do
it's
it.
going to make up for a lot of their discrepancies on defense. And so I'm taking the Texas over. I think OU and Texas, it's going to be the Big 12 championship. They're going to run it back, and we're going to get back to the Red River days.
Oh man. Wow. Well, listen, we're not disagreeing that this team is littered with talent. It's just it's hard for me to just put all my chips in the basket on Quinn Ewers when the guy hasn't played a single snap yet of college football. And unless he turns into the second coming of Vince Young as a freshman, I don't think Texas is going to hit this over. But I could be wrong. I think 9 is pretty high. I bet the under with my personal money here. I think that 7 to 8 wins is pretty likely. However, like don't get me wrong, I think this team could still finish in the top half of the Big 12, and they probably should finish in the top half of the Big 12. But getting the 10 wins, going 10-2, and with Alabama on that schedule, that's going to be really tough. And that offensive line, man, even if Quinn Ewers does turn out to be a stud, the offensive line depth, that definitely is a big question for me. And that's not to mention, I looked at their schedule in depth. They don't have a bye week until October 29th. And that's a long slate of games there before they get a bye week. And they have a stretch where they got to go Alabama, Texas Tech, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Iowa State, Oklahoma State before they even get a bye. That's going to be pretty tough. Those hits are going to start compounding on one another. And I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident in this under. But let's move on here. How about Oklahoma State? This was a team that was 1 foot away from winning a Big 12 championship last year and probably would have gotten to the college football playoff if that football had touched the pylon. Oklahoma State sitting at 9 wins coming off a 12-2 season. What do you got for them?
Well, just like you said, Shub, Oklahoma State season, they finally beat OU to get to the Big 12 championship just to fall an inch short. They've been a very reputable and very successful program over the last 15 years. When you look at this Oklahoma State team, though, they lost a lot of production, Shub. They lost Jalen Warren, their star running back. They lost Tay Martin, who was accountable for a significant proportion of their passing game. That is going to be hard for them to fill. But this team definitely has some talented receivers. They're just all very young. But so the only guy who's really known there is probably Brennan Presley. But everyone else there is young, unproven, and so Oklahoma State's got some guys to develop. Although I do think there is some upside with some of the guys they got there. They're an offensive program nonetheless. The offensive line's respectable. They're not great. They're not elite, but I think they're going to be better than they were last year. And then Shub, there's one thing I really, really have to point out about this team, and it's, as you alluded to, they lost their defensive coordinator Jim Knowles to Ohio State. This defense was absolutely outstanding last year. They were ranked fifth in all of FBS in yards allowed. They were number one in sacks. This defense was an absolute force. And when you compound them losing their coordinator, they also lost their starting 2 linebackers to the NFL. They lost 3 DBs to either the draft or transfer. They have significant holes to fill, Shub. Now, in the bright side, they did bring in Derek Mason from Auburn to replace the DC. He's got a good rap sheet as being a DC, but he's only there for a 2-year contract. And it's going to be interesting to see how he's going to implement the system for Oklahoma State and if their defense is going to take any steps back. They have a lot of unproven guys who are going to have to come in and fill those holes that in that defense, where the void was left, in addition to potentially having tweaks in the new system. So we're definitely going to see Oklahoma State take a step back defensively, even if they may still be a good defense. I don't see them being elite. They do return Colin Oliver, the freshman stud sackmaster, who basically led all freshmen in sacks. In addition to that, they return Brock Martin. So they've got a lot of good defensive pass rushers. I think they'll be stout in that particular scope. But it's the second level, Shub. The second level in the secondary, there's a lot of question marks. So Oklahoma State's going to have a hard time keeping up with Texas and Oklahoma, teams like that, who have a lot of firepower offensively. And so it's going to be very tough sledding for Oklahoma State. When you look over at their schedule here, I'm already chalking up OU as a loss because they've gotten their 1 win per 7 years or whatever. They got that last year. And then Maybe I think they'll beat Arizona State, Iowa State, Baylor, maybe Baylor because Baylor is a little bit down as of right now after losing all that talent to the NFL. But ultimately, I'm thinking Oklahoma State's an 8 to 9 win team, which is the under.
This team, I mean, this defense last year was special. They were number 2 in the entire country last year in defensive efficiency. Of course, you highlight they lost Jim Knowles, a defensive coordinator, to Ohio State. What a great hire by the Buckeyes there. We talked a lot about that in the Big Ten podcast. But the thing with this defense is that they have 5 starters returning, like you said. The defensive line was number 2 in the entire country in line yards. They were number 5 in the entire country in sack rate, and they should still be pretty good, at least the defensive line. That will definitely help carry this defense. And you look at the rest of the Big 12, a lot of these defenses are sort of built similarly, especially in the middle. A lot of really good defensive lines, but teams with questions in the secondary. And Oklahoma State is certainly that's the case with them. I think with Derek Mason, that was a good hire, and he should help salvage this defense. I think that obviously we shouldn't expect it to be a top 5, top 3 offense in the country. It'll regress down to maybe a top 20, top 25 defense. It still has a chance to be pretty solid. And then as far as the offense, you already highlighted the skill position players. It really boils down to Spencer Sanders with this offense. And he kind of reminds me of Spencer Petras in that I think that they're both 5th-year seniors. They're both veterans. They both have a lot of starts under their belt, but I feel like their ceiling is capped. I feel like who they are is who they are. And Spencer Sanders certainly got a lot more consistent last year. He did help limit his turnovers last year, but I don't really think there's another level to unlock with this game. That's just my opinion. So I think this offense should probably still be maybe a little bit better than they were last year. They do have their offensive coordinator finally returning for a 3rd straight season, so that helps Sanders' case. But I don't think that Sanders is going to take a massive step forward that's going to help supplement the loss that the defense is going to be experiencing. And then you look at the
Yeah.
schedule. I think the non-con, I really think they should go 3-0 in the non-con. I'm not high on Arizona State at all, and they have Arizona State at home. They should be 3-0 in the non-con, unless Spencer Sanders gets hurt, of course. And then there's the thing is their conference schedule is pretty tough. They got a tough draw. They got to go at Baylor, at TCU, at Kansas State, at Oklahoma. A lot of those tougher games are on the road in the Big 12. In addition, their bye week is pretty early in the year, and they have 9 straight conference games without a bye week. And if you look at this team, there's a lack of depth at quarterback. If Spencer Sanders gets hurt, which before last year, he had a history of injury problems. If Spencer Sanders gets hurt, this team is going to derail pretty quickly because there's 2 freshmen behind him that have virtually no experience. So a Spencer Sanders injury will certainly lock up an under for this team. I can't discount that possibility from happening. So with all that being said, you got to go under here. 9 is pretty high for this Oklahoma State team. I still think they can get there, but I think 6 to 8 wins is probably the more likely outcome for this team. I think that win total is pretty high, and it is juiced very heavily to the under on Caesars. So how about a team that won the Big 12 championship last year? They went to the Sugar Bowl and they beat Ole Miss last year, a 12-2 season. Dave Aranda, he came out of nowhere nationally, but he didn't come out of nowhere on this podcast. Xan, you were on Dave Aranda from the get-go. You said it is in stone. Back in 2020 when Baylor hired Dave Aranda, you said you loved that hire and you thought he was going to do really good things at Baylor, and that has certainly come to fruition. And their win total is sitting at 8 games. And you mentioned Baylor is one of those teams that loses a ton of production from last year's team. I don't think the drop-off is going to be that bad. But I think that if you look at this Baylor team last year, they did have good fortunes in some of those closer games. They went 4-1 in 1-possession games. They kind of did have things go their way. So I think maybe 12-2 is a little bit higher than what this team was actually, as far as a power rating standpoint. It was still a very good team. Don't get me wrong. The defense was number 9 in efficiency last year. It was a top 10 defense. 7 starters return, which is generally a good thing. But the problem with this Baylor defense is that 4 of their better players, all those guys left. Jalen Petre, Terrell Bernard, JT Woods, just to name 3 out of those guys. They did land a transfer Jackson player from Tulsa, which should add good depth to an offense or a defensive line that's already pretty good. So again, similar to Oklahoma State, this Baylor defensive line should be good and has a lot of depth, but secondary, big question mark. I still think that this defense should be pretty good. And then offensively, Gary Bohannon transferred, so that brings in Blake Shapen to be the new quarterback. And Blake Shapen, he really impressed me in the Big 12 championship game. He seems very accurate, and he does have a smaller sample size, but in that sample size of passes that he's got, he did have pretty solid numbers. And I think that he should be a mild upgrade over Gary Bohannon. Of course, Bohannon ran the ball a lot more. Shapen as a pocket passer, but I think this Baylor offense has a chance to be better than it was last year. I think that's a pretty good chance that that happens. The O-line has all veteran players and should be pretty good. The problem is they have a bunch of inexperienced receivers. This Baylor team does. That should be the biggest red flag for this Baylor offense is a ton of young and inexperienced receivers this year. So that is my one red flag with this Baylor team. And then you look at the schedule, the non-con, I think at the very least they should go 2-1. Of course, Albany and Texas State. Texas State's not going to be very good at all. But sandwiched in between those two is at BYU. That is a game that is flying under the radar. I'm telling you, when you think about non-conference games on the national scale that I'm looking forward to this year, Baylor at BYU, that's going to be a heck of a game. These are two pretty evenly matched teams. And I think Baylor definitely has a chance to beat BYU, but it's at BYU. So we'll see what happens with that. The problem with their conference schedule is that they got to go at OU and at Texas. And if you look at the win total sitting here at 8 wins, I just think that 7-5 is slightly more likely than 9-3. I wouldn't be surprised if Baylor is able to replicate what it did last year, but I think the chances of that are unlikely. So I'm going to play the under here, but would not be surprised at all if Baylor can get to 8 or 9 wins.
I agree with a lot of what you said, Shoob, about Baylor. They're definitely a formidable team still to this day, but there are some considerations. You did mention that you think their offense will be better this year despite having inexperienced wide receivers. One thing I look at with Baylor is they lost Treston Ebner, they lost Abram Smith, they have unproven running backs also. And so that's another red flag for me for this Baylor team. I think they're going to significantly struggle in the offensive end. Yes, I do like Blake Shapen the way that you mentioned. I actually think he's better than Jerry Bohannon, and I don't know why he was never starting over Jerry Bohannon all season. I think they may have even done even better than they had done last season had he been starting from the get-go.
Possibly.
But that's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. In addition to that, they lost Tyquan Thornton, and that's what you alluded to. They're very inexperienced at wide receiver. So there's definitely a little bit of question mark on the offense for Baylor for me. And when you mentioned that they lost their 4 best defenders, Shoob, they're 113th in defensive production, returning production. That's how good those 4 players were. Now, they still have a stud defensive lineman in Siaka Ika. He's definitely an NFL guy. And then you bring in Jackson Player. Their defensive line is still going to be pretty stout. But ultimately, this team's going to have some growing pains, I think, defensively early season. Because I believe in Dave Aranda. I believe that Dave Aranda will put this team together. But I think because we're putting new faces there in the early season, they may struggle defensively. But by midseason, they'll be back to Baylor form. And just it'll be another typical season for them. But I do think they are poised to take a step back, Shoob. I like them for a maximum of 8 wins this year, and the line is sitting there at 8. So with that being said, I got to take the under because I don't bet to push.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're both in agreement here with Baylor under, but we both wouldn't be surprised if they get to 8 wins. And you certainly can't deny that Dave Aranda is building a really good program at Baylor. This is definitely a program that's on the rise for sure. So how about Kansas State? This win total has been creeping up and up all offseason. It started at 6 wins and it's been creeping up. It was at 6.5. And we had to update this graphic because it recently bumped up to 7 wins now for Kansas State. What's your take on the Wildcats?
I like the Wildcats. I love their program a lot. I think Chris Kleinman's doing a great job over there. You know, they're a team that doesn't recruit at a very high rate, but at the same time, they get a lot for what they put out. They're a very good program in my estimation. I just wish they got some better players so we could see just how good they are. They promoted their former quarterback, their former legend quarterback, Colin Klein, to offensive coordinator. Right. And I think that is an underrated move. I think that is a huge move, especially for transfer Adrian Martinez, because Adrian Martinez is more of a mobile quarterback. Colin Klein was more of a powerhouse mobile quarterback. And Colin Klein is known for getting the most out of his quarterbacks when he was the QB coach. And so I think this is a match made in heaven, Shub. I think if Adrian Martinez is going to find success anywhere, I think it's going to be there with Colin Klein. I think Colin Klein can maximize his potential. And I think Colin Klein, being the OC, making the play calls, is going to do everything in his power to make sure they play within Adrian Martinez's talents. I think you can expect a lot of Deuce Vaughn read options. You can expect a lot of Adrian Martinez quarterback design runs. You can expect a lot from this team. They're going to have a stout offensive line led by Cooper Beebe. They're going to have a pretty good defense. They've got 3 guys who are projected to go to the NFL in the first 3 rounds right now in preseason stats. And right now, this team all around is actually pretty solid, Shub. When I look at them, I actually like them for about 7 wins. But because of all this upside that they have, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to lean towards the over because I think 8 wins is more likely than 6 wins. And if I'm going to, make a bet, I at least want to get my money back. And I think it's more likely they get the over than they get the under. So I will take K-State on the over.
I have a lot of good things to say about this Kansas State team. When you look at what happened to them last year, they finished the season 8-5. They beat LSU in the Texas Bowl when LSU was starting a wide receiver at quarterback. But this Kansas State team, if you look what happened to them last year, they won 5 out of their last 7 games. They finished the season very strong. And another thing is if you dive deeper into this team, they were number 17 in the entire country in schedule adjusted efficiency. Number 17. I don't think a lot of people would have guessed that. When I saw this, I was a little surprised. They were number 18 in schedule adjusted efficiency in total offense, and they were number 16 in total defense. Kansas State. How did this fly under the radar all season long? This team was power rated as a top 25 team, a top 20 team in efficiency on both sides of the ball all season long. This is why a lot of people are pretty high on this team going into 2022. Of course, Adrian Martinez, like you said, he replaces Skylar Thompson. And not to go back a year here, but I was such a big Skylar Thompson stan. I thought that guy was criminally underrated. I was upset that he would always seem to get hurt. And I just think that if Skylar Thompson, if he had played at a bigger school or bigger program, I think he would have been a big name in college football. And that also complements your point about Colin Klein as the OC. Colin Klein's been there as the quarterback's coach since 2017. He's got a lot of experience. He even was the co-offensive coordinator for 1 season. So like you said, I think I agree with you. I think he's going to fit well into this role. I was kind of surprised. Maybe some Kansas State fans, if you're listening or watching, you can comment. I was kind of surprised that their former offensive coordinator got fired and that Klein was promoted because the offense was still pretty solid last year, even though they didn't put up the eye-popping numbers. They were number 17 or number 16 in schedule adjusted efficiency. That's pretty dang good. But Adrian Martinez, of course, Nebraska fans like to refer to him as the turnover machine. Yes, he did used to be a turnover machine, but one thing that I pointed out, especially on the Big Ten win totals video, is that Adrian Martinez really cut the turnovers down last year. I think he actually had a really good season last year for Adrian Martinez standards. And I think that he was really efficient. I think he's going to be a good addition to this offense. And he's even said that he's making ball security a high priority this offseason. He's really wants to implement that as a strength of his game to be able to hold on to the ball. And let me ask you something, Xan. If you were to compare Adrian Martinez as a quarterback to any other quarterback in all of college football, who is the best Adrian Martinez comp, you think?
The best Adrian Martinez comp.
I'll give you a hint. He's a guy that's also in this conference.
Spencer Sanders.
Yes, he is Spencer Sanders 2.0. They both have the same exact skill set. They both had big turnover problems their first few seasons, and they both have a ton of starts. They have a ton of experience under their belts. The difference is Martinez is now just getting a fresh change of scenery going into Kansas State. And I agree with you, Xan. I think this Kansas State team will have a very good offense, maybe not quite as good as it was or efficient as with Skylar Thompson, but I could be wrong. There's certainly upside here. And as far as the defense, 6 starters return. 3 of those guys that are starters are projected transfers that Kleiman landed in the portal. And then we can't not mention this Kansas State squad without mentioning defensive end Felix Anodiki-Azuma. You want to talk about a sack machine. Anodiki was definitely one. He's a very good player. He's definitely going to be an NFL guy. That's a huge returning piece for this Kansas State defense. The secondary, like Baylor, like Oklahoma State, the secondary is the biggest question mark. But with the lack of elite quarterbacks in this conference, it might not be a huge problem. And then their schedule, non-conference, they have to go 2-1 minimum. I think they have a very good chance to go 3-0 because all three of their games at home, South Dakota, Tulane, they should be wins. Missouri at home in week 2. That's sort of a toss-up game, but I think Kansas State is a better team. Kansas State is at home. I think they can beat Missouri. I think Kansas State should expect to be 3-0 coming out of this non-conference slate. And then going into their conference schedule, it's sort of in the middle. It's not the toughest, but it's not the easiest. They got Oklahoma and Baylor both on the road, which is tough, but they have Oklahoma State and Texas at home, which certainly helps. For some reason, Kansas State has not been able to beat Texas. Texas has their number, but they got them at home this year. Maybe they can get them this year. I think 7 to 8 wins is very likely for this team, and I'm with you. There's upside here. I think this Kansas State squad has upside to be as high as 9-3 and even sneak their way into the Big 12 championship game. I wouldn't shy away from making that bet. I think that if you look at this Big 12 conference, Baylor is a team that, and Oklahoma State, they won a lot of close games last year. If Kansas State has that season where things kind of go their way and they have a few bounces go their way and they win a lot of those one possession games, because there's going to be a lot of those in this Big 12 conference. It's a very competitive conference from top to bottom. Kansas State can get on the winning side of some of those games. There is certainly the chance that they can win as high as 9 games and sneak their way into the Big 12 championship game. I wouldn't predict them to win this conference, but I think they can get there. There's upside for them to have that magical season. And I'm with you. I think Kansas State fans should be excited. And I got the over here. This is certainly an upside play for me.
Well said, Shoob. I like everything that you just said about K-State. 100% agree. I think Adrian Martinez is going to find a lot of success there. I think Colin Klein is going to help maximize his potential. Definitely an overplay for the Wildcats. Now, what about our other team in purple, the TCU Horned Frogs?
So TCU was another team that was one of the more disappointing teams in all of college football last season. Gary Patterson and them parted ways, and that was kind of awkward how that all went down. But TCU got their guy Sonny Dykes from SMU. That was a very interesting hire. And SMU has TCU's head on a spike. They want to beat them. There's going to be some heated rivalry and passion in that game. That was another low-key game that I'm looking forward to seeing this season in the non-conference. But as far as this team, of course, with Sonny Dykes, the offense, I think he inherits a pretty good situation offensively, to be honest. They were number 36 last year in schedule adjusted efficiency. The problem was the defense. The defense was atrocious. They were number 116th in all of FBS in defensive efficiency. That's pretty awful. And that's just not what we're used to seeing with these TCU teams. The vintage Gary Patterson team always had a very stout defense, and it just wasn't right. Things just didn't seem right last year for TCU. And that's why I think that the new change at head coach is Sonny Dykes. Apparently, he's got a lot of good vibes going there with this TCU program. A lot of players are bought in, and there's a lot of positive energy. And I think it's going to translate to a solid season for TCU. Of course, this win total sitting here up at 6.5. So the odds makers expect TCU to have a bounce back season. As far as their offense, of course, you can't not bring up the 2 quarterback options with Max Duggan and Chandler Morris, the Oklahoma transfer. Morris could potentially win this QB battle. Apparently, it's pretty close right now. Morris maybe fits into Sonny Dykes' system better. That's what a lot of people are saying. But I think either way, it's a very good thing that you have 2 very good quarterbacks as your option here. And I think if one of them doesn't end up performing well, there's a good chance the other one ends up performing well. So I think TCU has a good chance to have a really good offense this season. Of course, running back Kendre Miller, he impressed me in his numbers last year when I was looking at the stat sheet. And then, of course, they returned wide receivers Quentin Johnson and Darius Davis, who's also returning. Those are big pieces as well. I think this TCU offense has a chance to maybe even be like a top 25, top 20 offense. There may be a little bit of learning curve with Sonny Dykes' new system, but I think they should be pretty solid. Now, of course, the defense, when you have a defense that was that bad last year, it almost has by default has to be better this year. There's a lot of transfer portal turnover. They lost a lot of guys in the portal after Gary Patterson left, but there's a lot of juniors and seniors on this defense. So it is a veteran defense. And they have a new defensive coordinator, Joseph Gillespie from Tulsa. And I think that was a pretty good hire. You look at what Tulsa's done on defense in the past few seasons, they actually had a pretty respectable defense. And I think this was a very good hire, not a good hire, a great hire with Gillespie, a defensive coordinator. And like I said, number 116 last year, I don't think those guys were playing hard enough for Gary Patterson. I think by default, this defense is going to be better. Maybe not top 50 in one season. I don't expect that improvement, but I think everyone can agree here that TCU should expect to be good enough to make a bowl game this year. And then you look at their schedule. The non-conference is pretty interesting. As I mentioned, they go at SMU. They also got to go at Colorado to open the season. I'm not very high on this Colorado team at all. I think they should be able to beat Colorado, even though it's on the road. SMU, that one's going to be fun. I would not be surprised if they lose that game. I think all in all, best case scenario, of course, TCU can go 3-0 in their non-con, but I think 2-1 is probably more realistic. I think that especially fresh with the new systems being implemented, I think you probably drop one to SMU, most likely, maybe Colorado, but I'd say more likely SMU. And then their conference schedule is actually pretty favorable. However, they got Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Texas Tech, Iowa State at home. That is relatively favorable. I think 7 wins is very possible for this team. I don't think they'll just make a magical jump and get to 8 or 9 wins right off the bat with Sonny Dykes. But I think TCU, because they had a bad season last year, everyone's sort of writing them off and everyone's talking about Baylor and Oklahoma State. I think TCU can have a very good bounce back season, finish the top half of the Big 12. They're certainly good enough to get to a bowl game. You can't go wrong with 2 good QB options. Give me the over. I'm not super confident in it, but it's a slight lean for me. I think they can get to 7.
Well said, Shoob. Good points that you made there. I like everything that you said about that. I think Sonny Dykes is a good hire for TCU. I really like that defensive coordinator hire from Tulsa. I think that's going to really help them out. One thing, I mean, like what you said, by default, their defense has to be better, right? They bring in a new coordinator. Their defense was atrocious last year, 119th out of 130 teams in defensive yards allowed. That's absolutely terrible. One thing to really point out about TCU is they have great returning production on both sides of the ball, so they can only get better. But the thing is, the new system with Sonny Dykes as well, I think Max Duggan will eventually get the nod since he's a senior this year and he's been their starter for a little while. He's got the respect of the locker room, I'm sure. So that is my projection for TCU. They had the 36th rated offense last year, but let's keep in mind they lost Zach Evans, but they also picked up the Louisiana transfer Amani Bailey, which is another good gain. I mean, that Louisiana team got gutted, but that's for a whole nother time. Quentin Johnson is an outstanding wide receiver they have who will go in the first or second round. That dude is an absolute open field machine. Nobody can tackle him. He leads the NCAA in broken tackles for wide receivers, which is absolutely insane. He's a menace out there. So TCU's got a lot of offensive firepower. I definitely think they'll be formidable on offense. Their defense can only get a little bit better. And then when you look at that, Shoob, I do think they'll beat SMU. I think they'll come out 3-0 from their non-con. And then I like them to win at least 4 games in the Big 12, which would put them at 7. So with that being said, and the reasons that you said as well, I'm going to go with the over on TCU.
Nice. Bounce back year for the Frogs. Sonny Dykes. This is a program that can be at the top of the new Big 12. Like I said, everyone's talking about Baylor with Dave Aranda. Everyone's talking about Oklahoma State because they're usually always up there. People talk about Cincinnati, maybe UCF as being the new top dog in the Big 12. Do not write off TCU. This program has the upside to be that big dog in the new Big 12. Just give Sonny Dykes some time. Certainly can't write them off. And now moving down here to Iowa State, their line sitting at 6.5. This is a team that I think certainly you can say that they had a very disappointing season last year with how it turned out. This was a team that was ranked preseason top 10. And a lot of Iowa State fans thought that this team is good enough to go to the college football playoff, and they weren't able to get there. It was a little bit of a disappointing season. And that's something that for Iowa State, looking at the history of this program, talking about Iowa State and top 10 and college football playoff, those were unheard of 10 years ago. So Matt Campbell's got this thing in the right direction, obviously. But What's your take on the Cyclones for 2022?
Well, the Cyclones are without Brock Purdy. That just feels weird. Doesn't feel right. When you think the Cyclones, you think Brock Purdy. They lost Brees Hall, but there is some good news. They returned their star wide receiver, Xavier Hutchinson, who is the absolute cornerstone of their wide receiver core. It looks like for the time being, Hunter Deckers is going to be their starting quarterback, who was a previous four-star quarterback coming out of high school. And many people in the ISU fan base believe he's better than Brock. So we'll see. We'll see. Proof is in the pudding. It's hard to say, just like we go back to Texas with Quinn Ewers. It's hard to make anything out of someone who's had very limited snaps. I mean, Deckers has been seen on the field. He had 2 touchdowns and a pick, but it's a very small sample size, as we like to say, Shoob. So with that being said, they do bring in a star running back who's, I wouldn't say a star running back, but another 4-star guy who they hope will be the next heir in a line of very successful Iowa State running backs in recent memory, from Montgomery to Brees Hall. And they're hoping that Gerald Brock is going to be that next guy up, former 4-star. And he got some playing time last year, but not a significant amount, I guess you imagine, because Brees Hall was just that dude. And Iowa State's got a lot of talent. They have their 49th in offensive production last year. I mean, they lost Brees Hall and 9th in defensive yards allowed. So the defense is pretty stout. But one thing I really want to highlight about Iowa State that I'm really, really bullish on is only 40% of their all-around production, offensive and defensive returns, which is 128th of 130th in all of college football. So with that being said, I am very bullish on this team. I think they're going to have a lot of growing pains, Shoob. I think Matt Campbell's a great coach.
You mean bearish?
Yeah, very. I think Matt Campbell's a great coach. I think this team will eventually be good. I think they still have some key pieces there, like Xavier Hutchinson, but they don't have Charlie Kolar anymore, who was an absolute stud for them. They don't have Brees Hall. They don't have a lot of these pieces. They lost a lot of their defense as well. And it's just really hard for me to be super high on this team when I know there's going to be a lot of new faces and there's going to be a big learning curve. And with that being said, Shoob, I'm going to take the under for Iowa State. I think they're going to have about a 6-win type of year.
I think you meant to say you're bearish on Iowa State, not bullish. Bullish means you're buying them. Bearish means you're selling them.
Well, I'm meaning bullish in a way that I don't believe in them. That's mine.
All right. Xan's making up his new terms here on the Xan Shoob podcast. I like it. So by your definition, I am also bullish on this Iowa State team, but just barely. So you highlighted, I mean, obviously Brees Hall, you can't replace that production. He was fun to watch for this Iowa State team. There's a reason why he's a top end NFL draft pick. They only returned 8 total starters off of last year's team, only 8. That is one of the lowest in all of Power 5 going to the season, that number. If you look at this team last year, they went 7-6 last season. 7-6. This team was way better than what their record showed. Way better. They were 2-5 in one possession games last year. They were one of the unluckiest teams in all of college football last season. So on one hand, yes, they were a little bit of a disappointment in that they didn't live up to their top 10 expectations. They didn't compete for the Big 12 championship. But then on the other hand, they weren't that far off from that. If their luck had gone a different way, they could have been knocking on the door of the top 10. They were power rated as a top 15 team for most of all of last season, but they just were very unfortunate. They were the anti-Iowa, which is a whole nother separate thing. We could make an entire video on the Cyhawk rivalry there. For whatever reason, it is one of those random rivalries that I just do not understand for the life of me, how Iowa State loses to Iowa every year. It's just one of those things where Iowa State is cursed in that game. Iowa always seems to win that game, but that's a whole tangent for another day. Hunter Deckers, man, he's a huge question mark for me. He doesn't really have a ton of playing time, but in his small sample size, his numbers weren't really all that impressive. And a lot of when he came in was in garbage time too. So that's a huge question mark for me. Of course, Xavier Hutchinson, that's great. That'll help. They're probably going to throw a lot of balls to him to sort of help develop Deckers as a quarterback. And then on the defensive side of the ball, only 3 starters return off of last year's defense, but they do return edge Will McDonald, which I think is a good returning piece. He was their sack leader last year. So with that being said, however, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you this team is going to regress from last season. They just lost so much production. The schedule, I think, non-conference wise, 2-1 is very reasonable. They go at Iowa this year. As I just said, until they finally beat Iowa, I'm not going to predict them to beat Iowa. Iowa owns them. Just things just don't go right for them in that game. I'm going to say they go 2-1 in the non-conf. And then their conference schedule, it is reasonable, but I think what helps is that they get some of the lower tier teams at home. They get West Virginia at home and they get Texas Tech at home. And as I said before, when you're one of the bottom or middle tier teams and you're looking at these win totals, it's better if you get the lower teams at home because it gives you a better chance to rack up those wins. And you want to play the better teams away. And just if you're going to lose those games anyway, you might as well lose them on the road and get the better chances to beat the worst teams at home. But with that being said, I was originally over on this team, but I flipped at the last second to under. I think 7 wins is very possible, but I think 7 wins is probably the ceiling. I mean, I just can't put my faith in Hunter Deckers turning into an absolute stud based off of the limited sample of what we've seen from him. If you're an Iowa State fan, let us know what you think. I know Xan said that a lot of Iowa State fans think that he could be better than Brock Purdy. I want to know what you guys think. Please comment. But as of right now, I think there's going to be a big learning curve for Deckers. And I think that I will lean under here. I think 6-6 is a little bit more likely than 7-5. However, I will say, you see on the graphic here, we both have the down arrows for Iowa State. Wouldn't it be so Matt Campbell like if a year where everyone's writing them off and everyone thinks they're going to go back to being 6-6 Iowa State? Wouldn't it be a very good coaching job by Matt Campbell to get this team somehow to like 7-8 wins with a completely virtually new roster?
If anybody can do it, it's him. I mean, he's a proven coach. I definitely like him. I'm very happy he hasn't been poached yet. I would love for him to be, like a Mike Gundy type of guy at Iowa State, just there.
And I think that respect is why their win total is this high. I mean, if it weren't for Matt Campbell, I think this win total would be a little bit lower. I mean, these odds makers are projecting them to get to a bowl game after losing a ton of production. I mean, on the surface, I was kind of surprised to see it this high, but I think with Matt Campbell and Iowa State, don't buy when the stock is high, but don't sell when the stock is low. I think that Matt Campbell can get the squad to a bowl game, but I'm going to do a very slight lean to the under. And how about West Virginia sitting down at 5.5? This win total was sitting at 5. It ticked up to 5.5. West Virginia is a team that made a lot of noise for getting JT Daniels in the transfer portal. And I think you're going to find a lot of different takes for this West Virginia squad. I think obviously with JT Daniels, the biggest question is how much more of an upgrade is he going to be over Jarret Doege? I think he will be an upgrade over Jarret Doege. I'm not saying he won't be, but looking at JT Daniels' numbers, whenever he did get to play at USC and Georgia, I don't know if he is going to be as good as everyone thinks. That's sort of like my hot take on this for this Big 12 win totals podcast here. JT Daniels, yes, he was a 5-star, but there's a reason why he had to transfer out from USC. He lost the job to Keaton Slovis, who was a 3-star recruit at Georgia. I mean, obviously Stetson Bennett, all that talent at Georgia, he still couldn't win the job at Georgia. And now he finds himself at West Virginia. I mean, is this guy going to be Joe Burrow 2.0, or is he just going to be another slightly better version of Jarret Doege? I think he will be better than Doege. Doege was very mediocre, and I think West Virginia fans are probably happy to see him gone, but I don't think there's going to be this massive jump with JT Daniels at quarterback, like maybe some people think. As far as returning production, they're only 127th out of 131 in returning production. They lost a lot out of last year's team. The O-line returns all 5 starters, which actually is a good thing, and it should be improved. The offense as a whole will be better. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the offense won't be better. It certainly will be better. The problem with this team, though, however, is that the defense should regress a bit. And the defense was pretty solid last year. They were number 32 in total efficiency, but they only returned 3 starters. They lost a few of their better defensive players in the portal that went to other schools. I think this defense might fall out of the top 50 in total efficiency, and I think that might balance out the expected jump in offense. And a lot of new guys. Neil Brown brought in 5 transfers on this defense. Secondary's got 3 of them. It's another Big 12 team that has a bunch of question marks in the secondary. As far as the schedule, the non-conference is tough. I don't know what their athletic director is doing. They got to go at Pitt to open the season, then they go at Virginia Tech. So they're playing 2 Power 5 teams on the road in the non-con. They got Towson, which should be a win. I think if you're West Virginia, you got to be happy to go 2-1 in that non-con slate. I don't think you should be expecting to beat both Pitt and Virginia Tech on the road. I think 2-1, you got to be happy with that. If things don't go well, I think 1-2 is certainly a possibility. And then as far as their conference schedule, they have a couple of their more winnable games against the bottom tier teams on the road. They got to go at Iowa State and at Texas Tech. I don't think that bodes well. The schedule doesn't really do them any favors. I think getting the 6 wins is going to be tougher than it looks. I know a lot of people are high on this West Virginia team. I'm kind of fading them a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong, but now it's at 5.5. I got to go under. I think, like I said, 6 wins is a lot tougher than what it looks.
Well said, Shoob. I agree with a lot of what you said there. Another thing with their defense, they had a pretty stout defense last year. They also lost one of their best defensive players, though, in Akeem Messidor through transfer portal. That's going to hurt them big time on the D line. It's very unfortunate for the Mountaineers. So you hate to see it, but their defense is probably going to take a step back. I know that they did bring in a few extra defensive guys, so maybe they make up for it. But at the same time, it's learning the system and yada, yada, yada. The Mountaineers are a big question mark in every facet, offense, defense. I think their defense will still be good, not as good as last year. I think their offense will be slightly better under JT Daniels, but not a lot better, just mildly. But the reason—
So you agree with me on JT Daniels then?
I think he's going to be a little bit better than you're giving him credit for, but I don't think he's going to be elite. I don't think he's going to be the saving grace for the Mountaineers.
That's fair.
Yeah. But I'm going to go ahead and point to the non-conference, as you mentioned, Shoob. The non-conference is unfavorable to these guys. 2-1, like you said, is ideal. They may even go 1-2 in the non-con. They beat VTech last year. I don't know that they beat them again. It's going to be really interesting to see these matchups. And for that reason, because their non-con is kind of difficult for their standards and for the team that they have right now, for that reason, I'm going to take the under as well.
So we are both selling the Mountaineers. Hope for West Virginia's sake that they prove us wrong. If you're a West Virginia fan, let us know what you think about JT Daniels, of course. Like I say, for every team, comment, guys. If you're a fan of one of these teams, let us know what you think. If we're right, if we're wrong. You guys know your team better than we do. We try to give our unbiased take on your team. That's why we do this. But you guys watch your teams every week in and week out. You know them a lot better. Let us know what you guys think. So now transitioning down to a team that also had their win total tick from 5 up to 5.5. Texas Tech. They are hot on the recruiting trail. Joey McGuire is making a lot of noise off the field. But what will he be able to do on the field, Xan? What's your take for Texas Tech?
Just as you alluded to, Shoob, Joey McGuire is doing a fantastic job in recruiting right now. If you look at their current recruiting class, it looks like that they'll be a defensive force here in a year or two after those guys come in and get developed a little bit, get their bodies built up to play Power 5 football. And once that happens, I think Tech's going to be formidable, especially if they can keep this up. But we're speaking in terms of this season, unfortunately. And in terms of this season, I don't think Tech is going to be all that stout of a unit this year. Although I do think Tech has a bright future ahead of them. I will preface that. Now, they were 56th in offensive yardage produced last year. Not that great. 86th in defensive yards allowed. Not that great. They're killing it in recruiting, but at the same time, there's a lot of question marks, Shoob. I don't know that they have the answer at quarterback yet. Tyler Shugg hasn't really panned out yet. And they've also got Donovan Smith, who actually looked decent in a small sample size. I think Shugg will come out as a starter, but I think Donovan Smith would not shock me if he ended up taking the job at some point mid-season. Donovan Smith did play well in Shugg's absence. So I do want to mention that they did go pretty well. They did do a pretty good job in the portal, boosting their offensive line and getting some additional people to develop as well. They picked up 2-3 extra linemen on the offensive line, and that will probably be impactful for them in the future. And they've also got 3 seniors starting on their offensive line as well. So they'll have some decent protection this year at the position. I do like a couple of their younger players, Taj Brooks and Miles Price. I do think that those two are actually poised to have pretty big years this year. I think Miles Price could be a potential 1,000 yard guy this year. And I do think that Taj Brooks, with the heavier workload this year, could potentially be a 1,000 yard rusher. It remains to be seen, but those are some guys that I really like from that Tech team that is currently, or that are currently on the roster. But it's really hard because they're one of the worst teams in returning production in all of college football again. It's really hard to be really positively seeing this team in a positive light. But for that reason, I'm going under Shoob. Although in the future, Tech fans, it's bright.
Absolutely. I reiterate most of what you said. One thing about the offense, though, with Tyler Shuck and Donovan Smith, that's actually an underrated QB battle. I think probably Shuck will get the nod, but I think Donovan Smith, especially long term, Donovan Smith's got some upside. He impressed me too. I think Texas Tech fans got to be really excited about the near future going beyond this season. But like you said, we're here for 2022. So I think that Joey McGuire hit a slam dunk hire in offensive coordinator Zach Kitley from Western Kentucky. I mean, the guy was the offensive coordinator at Houston Baptist for a few years, and then he was the OC at Western Kentucky last year when Bailey Zappi broke the NCAA record for passing touchdowns. What a tremendous hire. I think obviously it might take some time for these guys to get used to his system, but as long as he stays there at Tech, I mean, you talk about some schools down at the bottom here, the Big 12, making some really good underrated coordinator hires. Gillespie at TCU, Kitley at Texas Tech. The future is bright for some of these schools, man. This Big 12 conference is really going to be competitive in the near future once OU and Texas leave. And I think that, of course, the offense, one of the biggest problems is that the offensive line, as you alluded, with all the new transfer starters, it's probably going to start out pretty slow. It's probably going to be pretty poor offensive line play at the beginning of the season, but they probably will get better as the season goes on, as they get more experience working with one another. And then the receiving core is super inexperienced. So that's also a big red flag. So this offense will probably struggle out of the gate, would be my guess. But as the season goes on, I think this is a team that gets better, especially offensively with the new system. And then defensively, they returned 7 starters, which is normally a good thing. They have some good players. I was looking at some of the stats and they kind of impressed me. They do have some guys that really jumped off at the stat sheet. It wasn't a good defense as a whole, as a unit last year. They were only 100th in schedule adjusted efficiency. I think they're going to be a little bit better. They have to be better. Some of these guys, like I said, I'm high on. I don't think Texas Tech will make a major rise into like the top 50 defensive wise, but I could see them jumping maybe like top 70, top 60. That's a pretty reasonable jump to take if you're 100th in FBS last year. And as far as the schedule, non-con is tough, man. I mean, Murray State at home to open the year, that should be a win. But then you got Houston coming in week 2. That's sort of a toss-up. I think Houston is just a slight favorite in that game. I'm personally kind of high on this Houston team with Clayton Tune and that defense. I think Tech's going to have their hands full, especially like I alluded to. It's probably going to take them a while to get going. I think Tech beat Houston last year. They were their only loss in the regular season. I think Houston gets them this year in Lubbock. And then they got to go at NC State. I mean, come on. NC State, we're both very high on them. NC State should probably win that game. That defense is going to be really good for the Wolfpack. So I think Texas Tech, if you finish 2-1 out of the non-con, you got to be happy as a Tech fan. And then as far as their conference schedule, 6 wins total is going to be very tough with this schedule. Of course, there's upside for more because, like we said, there are some players that we like individually that we really like on this team. It's just hard for me to see this all meshing, especially with the way their schedule is. They have a stretch where they go Houston at home, at NC State, Texas, at Kansas State, at Oklahoma State. 5 in a row. That stretch is tough. I don't think Texas Tech is going to get to more than 6 wins. 6 wins would be pretty impressive. Now that the line's ticked up to 5.5, I got to go under. I'm with you. But if you want to take a long-term outlook for this program, I think you and I both agree. Long-term arrow up for this Texas Tech program at Joey McGuire. So now, last but not least, and I mean that, the Kansas Jayhawks, their win total is sitting at 2.5. Xan, what was Kansas most famous for doing last year?
Beating Texas.
Beating Texas. Kansas
Just
finished last year with 2 wins. And let me tell you something, Lance Leipold, I love that guy. I think obviously it's going to take a ton of time. I think that he will get Kansas back to a bowl game in the near future. I think that he can build this program up. He did it at Buffalo. It's going to be slow and steady, but I'm very bullish on the future of this Kansas program. Of course, though, he's inheriting a very bad roster, and even it's year two. That's why the win total is sitting at 2.5. Believe it or not, this thing only opened up at 1.5, and the over got hammered. So it jumped up to 2.5. I wish I got in on that, to be honest. I think the biggest thing for this Kansas team, I'm not going to go super in depth, but they are seventh the entire country in returning production, seventh in all of FBS, which certainly is a good thing. And I look at their quarterback room. Quarterback Jalen Daniels last year, he didn't really play for most of the season. He only played about a third of the season because Jason Bean was the starting quarterback for the first 2/3 of the season. When Jalen Daniels came in, he was better than Bean. And if you go back and watch the highlights from that Texas game, that Jalen Daniels dude, he balled out against Texas. That didn't look like a scrub Kansas quarterback to me. That dude balled out. And now that Jalen Daniels is expected to be the projected starter for the entire season, I think people are kind of lowballing Kansas. And I'm dead serious here. I think they're being lowballed a little bit. I think Jalen Daniels, assuming health and he plays all season, I'm a little bullish on this team. Look at what they did last year when Jalen Daniels came in as quarterback. This is their games at the end of last year. They lost to OU by 13 at home. I think people forget that. That OU game last year, Kansas was winning late in the second half, and then OU had a few things go their way and they pulled away, but Kansas was very competitive in that game. They lost to TCU by only 3 points, and then they lost to West Virginia by only 6 at the end of the year. So these guys played hard when they had really nothing to play for under Leipold. He had these guys playing hard. And you look at their schedule this year, they open up a Tennessee Tech at home, should be a win. Then you look at their non-con, they got to go at Houston, that's an L. Then they got Duke at home. And Xan, after we did our ACC win totals, what did we have to say about Duke?
Duke's not going to win. Kansas is going to beat Duke for sure.
Kansas
Duke is
is
awful.
Kansas is going to be better than Duke. They're a projected 10-point favorite as of now. That's 2 wins in the bag. They only got to get one more to hit this win total. And Xan, I think the Kansas Jayhawks are going to pick somebody off in Big 12 play. I don't know who it is. I'm not going to try to guess which team it will be, but I think that these dudes play hard under Lance Leipold. They are always the team that gets written off. They are sort of the down game for every Big 12 team. When they see Kansas on the schedule, it's like, oh, okay, we can sort of relax this week, not try as hard in practice, maybe be going to this game half asleep. They are that team for the Big 12. I think the Kansas Jayhawks get to 3 wins, and I am going over Kansas.
Thank you, Texas.
Kansas, 3 wins. If they beat Texas again, my God, that would be someone get the 30 for 30 fired up. But I'm like I said, I don't know who it is. I don't know who they beat in the Big 12 conference play. They get 3 wins. I'm calling it right now. Jalen Daniels, quarterback, big upgrade over Bean. Give me the Kansas Jayhawks over.
You know what, Shoob? I can totally see that happening. I can totally see them winning 2 of their non-con and totally see them picking someone off in the Big 12. They've had a couple of those close Big 12 games in the past, especially last year. It's definitely doable, especially with all the returning production, and especially if we see improvement from their quarterback play. Not to mention their wide receiver core has been there for a couple of years there. They have some continuity now, so there's going to be a little bit of better, just coordination between the quarterback and wide receivers. They're going to have that cadence right. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this offense. I think the over is a good play, Shoob, but I'm just not a Kansas believer, and I'm going to take the under. And I do like Kai Thomas, one of their running backs over there. I think he's got a lot of potential.
Transfer from Minnesota.
Yeah, transfer from Minnesota. But ultimately, I just don't see it, man. I don't see it. I think what's going to happen is Kansas is going to have a lot of close Big 12 games, but I feel like they're just going to fall short.
Hmm.
But I think it's very, very doable. All it takes is one game because I do think two of their non-cons are very winnable. Two of their non-cons are very winnable. But the over is definitely something that I could see, but I'm going to take the under because it's the Jayhawks.
Just FYI, I think that when this Kansas and Duke game comes out, it's going to be week 4 when these two play each other. This game will probably get like an uneven or undeserved amount of attention because it's like the two like bottom teams historically of the Power Five playing each other and like the
The
bottom
toilet
tier.
bowl.
Yeah, the toilet bowl, but the schools are like elite blue bloods in basketball. That game, for my personal money, I bet this Kansas over and I also hammered the Duke under. That game, I'm going to actually be paying massive attention to because that's like a huge swing for my win totals. Because, like I said, I have the Kansas over and the Duke under. And if Duke wins that game and Lawrence, neither of those are going to hit, I don't think. Maybe Duke will still hit, but that's a huge swing for my personal bets. So I'm going to be pretty invested in this game, I will be very invested in the toilet bowl, but also blue bloods and basketball bowl.
They should name it that. That's the official name. Put a trademark on it. Well, with that being said, that's all the time that we have for you guys today. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you watching. If you liked the content, feel free to like, subscribe, follow our podcast. If you have anything that you want to tell us about your fan base, something that we left off, something that you see that maybe we didn't see, let us know. Or if you feel that we've made any mistakes, let us know as well, because we want to give you the most accurate information we possibly can. And with that being said, this is Xan Shoob signing out. Thank you for watching.
Thank you guys. See ya.